So, the Senate Judiciary Committee has been listening to the testimony of the CEOs of Twitter and Facebook over the current election cycle, specifically about tweets and Facebook posts that have been either removed or had addendums added to them in a response to conservative talking points. And I found a clip where Ted Cruz, in particular, is speaking to these two CEOs, mostly to Jack Dorsey. And I wanted to kind of explore this a little bit and the nuance that goes into it around two major corporations with a near monopolistic power going against the conservative talking points of a major Republican figure, and how that figures into our understanding of our online space and what implications those could have. With given that, let's take a look at the video.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Facebook and Twitter and Google have massive power. They have a monopoly on public discourse in the online arena.
Nearly
I will say
true,
it's
yeah.
dismaying listening to the questions from our Democratic colleagues, because consistently the message from Senate Democrats is for Facebook and Twitter and Google to censor more, to abuse their power more, to silence voices that Senate Democrats disagree with more.
So, one of the issues right off the bat is when we typically think about censorship and the ability to limit speech or limit certain things, usually that is something that we think of with government. The government cannot stop you from assembling. The government cannot stop you from not being able to like practice your religion or anything like that. The government cannot infringe on your speech. But private institutions are allowed to do that all the time. As a matter of fact, the example that comes to my mind is in a movie theater. If you are in a theater and someone gets up and starts screaming off the top of their lungs, more than likely a manager will get one of their employees and will make the employee uncomfortably remove that person. And that's done so that everyone else in the theater can continue to enjoy the movie, because that one person was disrupting everything. So there are instances in which one can, as a private business owner, limit speech in order to preserve the business and the space that they're in. And given that Twitter and Facebook are both private institutions, that means that their TOS should be the major determining factor, or even their whims to a certain regard should be major factors in what's allowed on their platforms or not. So if they do not wish to have certain things on their platform that speak to things that are allegations and maybe not considered generally factual or have scientific evidence to support them, then it is in their best interest, in their opinion, to remove that content, and that should be entirely up to them. Where I see a problem in this and where it potentially gets dangerous is if they were not speaking out in against unscientific principles, but were rather using their platform to suppress social justice issues. We would probably be up in arms on the left about something like that. If they were to say, oh, you can't express your transness, or oh, you can't have photos of your same gender partner on the platform because that's a violation of our terms and services, we would be outraged that this monopolistic huge power was telling us that we couldn't express our daily lives and experiences. And while I'm not advocating that they should be allowing this very big disinformation campaign that's actively causing mistrust in this country and putting the potential of a coup in all of our minds and making it very real, which the Trump administration's doing enough of anyway, I don't think they have a responsibility to platform that. So what exactly is the difference there? Well, for one, there are protections against those kind of things, specifically that businesses can't discriminate against certain things on platforms. But if they were to do such a thing and they were to try to claim that kind of power, we would be rightfully outraged. So that kind of monopolistic control is potentially dangerous. And it's only stopped because of government interference, because they could theoretically do whatever they wanted if there was no protections in play from the government.
That is very dangerous if we want to maintain a free and fair democracy, if we want to maintain free speech. There was a time when Democrats embraced and defended the principles of free speech. There was a time when Democrats embraced and defended the principles of a free press. And yet there's an absolute silence from Democrats speaking up for the press outlets censored by big tech. There's an absolute silence for Democrats speaking out for the citizens silenced by big tech. Instead, there is a demand, use even more power to silence dissent. And that's a totalitarian instinct that I think is very dangerous.
I don't think it's totalitarian in any regard, especially with the current claims that are being made, specifically around voter fraud. They're allegations. They're up in a court of law. If we were to have a situation where somebody were to say, this person murdered this person, that would be considered a form of libel or slander, because they have allegedly murdered that person. That's why a lot of news outlets use that word allegedly. So if you were to come out and say, I allege that there's voter fraud, or there's alleged voter fraud, the conversation might be a little different. But to flat out say there's definitely voter fraud when there's no proof or evidence and the proof and burden is on the group of people making that claim, I think it's quite problematic to just let them say that kind of thing without that thing being removed.
At the same time that big tech exercises massive power, it also enjoys massive corporate welfare through the effect of Section 230, a special immunity from liability that nobody else gets. Congress has given big tech, in effect, a subsidy while they become some of the wealthiest corporations on the face of the planet. Mr. Dorsey, I want to focus primarily on Twitter and ask you initially, is Twitter a publisher?
Is Twitter a publisher?
Yes.
No, we are not. We distribute information.
So what is a publisher?
An entity that is publishing under editorial guidelines and decisions.
Well, your answer happens to be contrary to the text of federal statute, particular Section 230, which defines an information content provider as any person or entity that is responsible in whole or in part for the creation or development of information provided through the internet or any other interactive computer service. Let me ask you, was Twitter being a publisher when it censored the New York Post?
So here's the issue around being a publisher versus a platform for distribution. What ends up happening is if we define a platform like Twitter or Facebook as a publisher, they are responsible for every single word that is put on the platform. I would argue that would actually limit free speech because the majority of people would not be able to use the platform because there would be no incentive for Twitter or Facebook to continue that platform existing because there's no way for them to monitor every single word. So it would actually reduce the amount of voices that are heard. That would be the kind of thing that would actually allow someone like Ted Cruz to find the loophole to removing the ability for the majority of people to speak publicly on the online space. So it no longer would just be a certain group of people being censored, but rather the entire population of the online space. Because, again, there's no incentive for Twitter or Facebook to put their financial liability at risk for any person who can tweet any random thing. Especially when the President of the United States is the one who's called for the expansion of libel laws, which makes it kind of counterintuitive that they're kind of the ones calling for free speech right now.
No, we have very clear policies on the conduct we enable on the platform. And if there's a violation, we take enforcement action and people choose to commit to those policies and to those terms of service.
Except your policies are applied in a partisan and selective manner. You claim it was hacked materials, and yet you didn't block the distribution of the New York Times story that alleged to talk about President Trump's tax returns, even though a federal statute makes it a crime to distribute someone's tax returns without their consent. You didn't block any of that discussion, did you?
Our policy was focused on distribution of the actual hacked materials.
Did you block the discussion of the president's tax return material?
And in the New York Times case, we interpret it as reporting about the hacked materials.
Did you block Edward Snowden when...
So what he's getting at is actually a really important distinction. it is illegal to take certain hacked materials and post it online. So what he's arguing is that the New York Post essentially posted a direct hacked thing onto Twitter, which means they had every right to take down illegal content. However, the New York Times received leaks of the tax returns for Donald Trump, but never actually posted them. And the fact that they got these illegal documents is actually protected by the Supreme Court. There was a Supreme Court case that happened during the, I believe it was the time of the Watergate scandal, where the finding of information about that particular scandal that was leaked was technically done in a potentially illegal manner, but that illegal leak was able to be taken by the New York Times. And I think there was a bunch of stuff with the Vietnam War that was also published around that time or on certain things like that. That basically the newspapers have a certain protection when they get something from an illegal source to publish that information. So Twitter then says, hey, the New York Times is talking about this, and this is what the New York Times says and is advocating for. And even though we don't have the actual illegal documents, this is what the New York Times says, as opposed to the Post, again, who posted the illegal document itself or the illegal hack itself. And therefore, there's a huge distinction, and Ted Cruz is just walking right over that.
When he illegally released material?
I don't have the answer to that.
The answer is no. You haven't used this in a selective manner. Let me ask you, were you being a publisher when you forced Politico, another journalistic outlet, to take down their tweets on a topic that you had deemed impermissible?
No. We were enforcing our policy and our terms of service.
So on October 15th, Jake Sherman, a reporter at Politico, tweeted the following. I tweeted a link to the New York Post story right after it dropped yesterday morning. I immediately reached out to the Biden campaign to see if they had any answer. I wish I'd given the story a closer read before tweeting it. Twitter suspended me. So you actually have a reporter reporting on a story, asking the other side for comment. And Twitter says, hi, Jake Sherman, your account at Jake Sherman has been locked for violating Twitter rules. Now, what did the Politico reporter do? Immediately tweets after that, my goal was not to spread information. Well, that's a little worrisome just in and of itself. My goal was to raise questions about the story. Oh, my overlords in Silicon Valley, I was attacking the New York Post. You don't understand. I was attacking them, as I did in subsequent tweets, and see how the Biden campaign was going to respond. They later did respond. And then, not long after, Jake Sherman comes back with, my account is clearly no longer suspended. I deleted the tweet. When Twitter is editing and censoring and silencing the New York Post, the newspaper with the fourth highest circulation in the country, and Politico, one of the leading newspapers in the country, is Twitter behaving as a publisher when it's deciding what stories reporters are allowed to write and publish and what stories they're not?
No, and that account was not suspended. It fell afoul of the hacked materials policy. We realized that there was an error in that policy and the enforcement.
Hold on. I'm literally looking at the tweet from Twitter that says your account has been locked. You're telling me that this is not an accurate...
That's a lock and can be unlocked when you delete the...
I understand that you have the star chamber power. Your answer is always, well, once we silence you, we can choose to allow you to speak. But you are engaged in publishing decisions. Let me shift to a different topic.
He's using the word publish again really, really strongly here because he'd like to make it so that places like Twitter could not get away with anything and would actually silence a larger portion of the population. It would actually be against democratic principles for them to be listed as a publisher. And he knows what he's doing here. Furthermore, when it comes to that particular instance, I can't speak to what Politico wrote, but what was being said by Jack Dorsey is that it was tied to the hacks. And so as long as they removed the thing that violated their terms of services, specifically illegal hacked material, they were allowed to continue speaking on Twitter. It wasn't a matter of, oh, we're going to silence you or ban you forever. It was a violation of terms of services. And that makes for a very complicated debate again, but it's a lot more difficult when there's actual illegal content being posted directly to the platform. And it's kind of a catch-22 because I feel like someone like Ted Cruz would come out of this the same way and be like, you allowed illegal content on your platform. Therefore, we need to ban you and we need to make you a publisher. So it's like these corporations can't win. And I can't believe I'm defending them. But again, this is the kind of nuance like debate that's going on here, where how do you maneuver speech on the internet in such a way that makes it so that nobody's being harmed, false information is not leaking out, but at the same time people have a right, as many people as possible have a right to continue free speech without things being just completely destroyed. And how do you take that power and consolidate it in any sort of way without a private institution just like Twitter or Facebook having just monopolistic control and getting to determine so much? There's a lot wrong here. And personally, I think the answer is socialism. But, neither of the people in this debate really are probably vested and interested in that.
Topic. Mr. Dorsey, does voter fraud exist?
I don't know for certain.
Are you an expert in voter fraud?
No, I'm not.
Well, why then is Twitter right now putting purported warnings on virtually any statement about voter fraud?
We're simply linking to a broader conversation so that people have more information.
No, you're not. You put up a page that says, quote, voter fraud of any kind is exceedingly rare in the United States. That's not linking to a broader conversation. That's taking a disputed policy position.
That is not a disputed policy position. That is an actual factual piece of information. Voter fraud is remarkably rare in this country, in the United States. And if you want to assert that it's not, you have the burden of proof to change that discourse. You have to prove, Ted Cruz, or anybody else on the Republican Party, that it is a lot greater than it is. You have to prove that it is through the courts. And until the courts decide otherwise, which I have seen no evidence that they are, then it is rare in this country. That is not a political statement. That is a true statement.
And you're a publisher when you're doing that. You're entitled to take a policy position, but you don't get to pretend you're not a publisher and get a special benefit under Section 230 as a result.
That link is pointing to a broader conversation with tweets from publishers and people all around the country.
Mr. Dorsey, would the following statement violate Twitter's policies? Quote, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud.
I imagine that we would label it so that people can have more context.
How about this quote?
So it's not really censorship, is it, if you're just putting an addendum? It's not censorship to have a response. It's just not. That's not how it works. Censorship is the removal of speech. Your speech is fine and is allowed to be up there. But also that particular statement, I want to hear it again, but I know that statement was not factual.
Imagine that we all around the country is pointing to
position, and you're a publisher when you're doing that. You're entitled to take a policy position, but you don't get to pretend you're not a publisher and get a special benefit under Section 230 as a result.
That link is pointing to a broader conversation with tweets from publishers and people all around the country.
Mr. Dorsey, would the following statement violate Twitter's policies? Quote, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud.
Remain the potential source of voter fraud. Oh, wait, that's an interesting
Statement
one.
violate Twitter's policies. Quote, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud.
No, that is not true. That should not be allowed. It is not the largest source of potential voter fraud. There's no proof of that. There's no proof that there's been any voter fraud. And until there is, then that is not a factual statement. And yes, that should come with an addendum.
I imagine that we would label it so that people can have more context.
How about this quote? Quote, third-party organizations, candidates, and political activists. Voter fraud is particularly possible where, quote, third-party organizations, candidates, and political party activists are involved in, quote, handling absentee ballots. Would you flag that as potentially misleading?
I don't know the specifics of how we might enforce that, but I imagine a lot of these would have a label pointing people to a bigger conversation.
Well, you're right. You would label them because you've taken the political position right now that voter fraud doesn't exist. I would note both of those quotes come from the Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform. That is Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker. And Twitter's position is essentially voter fraud does not exist. Are you?
So here's the thing. He's not taking that specific political position because there is no political position. There is no political position that voter fraud does exist. You can't have a political position that's not based in reality. You have to have factual evidence to pull up that particular political position. Specifically, what are you basing it on? What is the basis of that political position? You know, generally speaking, even if I don't disagree with it, something like, even if I don't agree with a lot of the conservative talking points, there is some of their arguments that have some form of consensus or understanding behind it. I like capitalism, for example, because I get money off of it, and I don't like taxes because I get some sort of thing off of it. There's a logical reasoning there that maybe I interpret as selfish and not good, but at least I can understand where they're coming from. That can be a political position. But to say there's voter fraud when there's no evidence of it and the courts have not deemed it, and it's something that's being tied up in the legal system that a lot of the conservatives tend to have faith in, a lot more than the people on the left for sure, then you really can't say that that's really a political position. That's just a conspiracy theory at that point. And I think that's concerning to me.
Aware that just 2 weeks ago in the state of Texas, a woman was charged with 134 counts of election fraud. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware.
I have heard nothing about that. I'm going to look that up quick. 134 counts of voter fraud. It was in Texas, right? Texas social worker charged with 134 counts of election fraud. Let's see. Attorney General Ken Paxton announced Friday that his election fraud unit and other officials charged this person, a social worker, with 134 felony counts of purportedly acting as an agent of election fraud. The person submitted voter registration applications for 67 residents without their signature or effective consent while purporting to act as their agent. Okay. So voter fraud was found. Voter fraud was dealt with. Let's see. Voter registration. Was this done specifically with mail-in ballots? Let's see. While purporting to act as their agent. I strongly commend registering citizens to vote or obtain mail-in ballots without their consent is illegal. So, yeah, this was one case of voter fraud. Great. That doesn't mean it's widespread. 134 people within all of Texas or within all of the United States is not widespread voter fraud. Furthermore, in this particular instance, they caught it, and it was a person registering or voting with other people's mail-in ballots. It wasn't like the same type of thing that they are purporting that there's 50,000 ballots coming out of nowhere, or that people are writing on ballots in certain places. So, yeah, no. And this is also an issue that's probably around a form of ableism, if I'm understanding it, where they took people's, they took the votes from people who may have not had the ability to vote for themselves. It is offensive when individuals purport to be champions for disability rights, when in reality they're abusing our most vulnerable citizens in order to gain access to their ballots and amplify their own political voice. See, that's messed up. I'll come out and say that that's messed up. But this isn't an example of rampant voter fraud through specifically mail-in ballots. There's no reason mail-in ballots had to be the reason that this person was able to get away with this.
If I tweeted that statement with a link to the indictment, would you put a warning on it that says, well, the Democratic Party position right now is voter fraud doesn't exist?
I don't think it's useful to get into hypotheticals, but I don't believe so.
You don't believe so? Well, we're going to test that because I'm going to tweet that and we'll see what you put on it. All right. Yesterday, Mr. Dorsey, you and I spent...
You know what's interesting about that one? He said he would blow it because it's true.
Considerable amount of time on the phone, and you said that you wanted to embrace transparency. So I want to ask you, I have asked Twitter, I've asked Facebook multiple times, How many times have you blocked Republican candidates for office, their tweets or their posts in 2016 and 2018 and 2020? How many times have you blocked Democratic candidates for office? How many times have you blocked Republican office holders? How many times have you blocked Democratic office holders? Twitter has repeatedly refused to answer that question with specific hard data and cataloging the examples. In the interest of transparency, which you said you want to embrace, will you commit in this hearing right now to answer those questions in writing?
That's exactly what we want to do.
Question. Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dorsey, I didn't hear you.
That's exactly what we're pushing for as we think about building upon 230.
Is that a yes that you will answer those questions in writing?
Transparency, not just of outcomes, but also our process as well.
Is that a yes that you will answer those questions in writing?
We'll certainly look into it and see what we can do.
And actually answer them and not give lawyerly doublespeak about why you're not going to give specifics. Answer them. Will you commit to this committee that you will answer those questions?
We're going to work to answering broader transparency around outcomes.
All right, that's a no. Mr. Zuckerberg, how about
That would be a really difficult thing to find, to go back to 2016, 2018, and 2020 and find all those things. He could demand that for the future, but I don't even know if a big tech company like them has that capability. Maybe I'm underestimating that. That seems rather difficult.
will you commit that Facebook will answer those specific questions, cataloging the number of instances in which Democrats in 16, 18, and 20 have been silenced versus the number of instances in which Republicans have been silenced on Facebook?
Senator, I'm not sure if we have that data available, but I will follow up with you or your team.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes, and I'm going to take Twitter. We'll see if it's a...
Why did you take that as a yes? He just said he doesn't know if he has the data available. That's the exact thing I was concerned about with the Twitter situation. That's very specific data that he wants.
yes, or transparency is bogus and we don't intend to provide it.
Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So this is like you heard, just really complicated. This is a question not only of free speech and censorship, but of public space. Like, what is defined as a public space in terms of the internet? And what is the greater good here in terms of Facebook and Twitter? Do we allow them to maintain their platform and be a platform and do that? Or do we relinquish all of our online space in the name of some form of bizarre understanding of free speech where we no longer get it anymore by turning them into a publisher? Ted Cruz seems to be pushing in that regard, and that's not acceptable. As for the 134 counts of voter fraud that did occur, if that's factual and there's information behind it, by all means post it. That doesn't mean it's rampant. That doesn't mean it's across the country. That doesn't mean it's everywhere. Let the courts deal with it. The courts are going to deal with it as best they can, right? Like, that's why we have courts. And I'm not the biggest fan of courts. I'm not the biggest fan of the legal system. But in this particular case, when you're dealing with allegations of this kind, that there's mass voter fraud and that the Biden administration did this thing or that people aren't counting the votes properly, the burden of proof is on the people who are making those claims. And there's no evidence. And the little cases like that where there's 134 cases, that's not enough to say that it's widespread. It is still relatively low. 134 cases that got caught. They got caught. Like, this isn't rampant, like, where we're not catching it all the time. This was the most observed and watched election in the history of the United States. There's no way. And that said, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell for notifications. You can check out my Twitter down below, which, you know, is owned by a corporate monopoly. And you can check out my brand new Discord in the description. Feel free to come check in and join the conversation. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.